sweeties, how are you doing? Welcome to Naya Sim. If this is your first time of coming across this channel, sweetheart, kindly smash that subscribe button, turn on the notification so you get notified each time I upload, and please give this video a thumb up. I appreciate you all so much, and I am saying a very big shout out to every one of you for all the love and support you all give me here. I am truly grateful. So today we'll be talking something very important, and it was more like a debate between Joe Rogan, and he was explaining systemic racism to Ben Shapiro, right? And they started by saying that, like, it was more like the reasons for an unequal outcome in the United States and along racial lines, right? And it is actually a very relevant discussion about systemic racism. And they talked about racism, Jim Crow, and the impact of racism and Jim Crow law, how it affected Black people, and they were saying that Black people shouldn't put everything on history. And I am going to start. How do you want them not to put everything on history? Because that history was their starting point, and it is their foundation. And you don't tell people to let go of their foundation. That is gaslighting if you say that. And they know that everything in America is not 50-50. And the way they fight the system by making great decisions, that Black people have to fight the system by making great decisions. And the other one was trying to let them know that their ancestors were dragged here. They were pushed down here. And most of that, they also try to explain that the system in America right now is kind of designed to keep them in a particular kind of way. Redlining and the very rest of it. Actually, they made great point, and you do not want to miss out on this. Stay to the screen because I am going to roll this clip, and then we'll come back to talk about it. And I absolutely want to read all your comments. Let me know what you all think in the comment section. And straight up, I am rolling the clip.
Yesterday between Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro. And I looked at it, and it is super interesting, and I want to talk about it. Right-wing darling Ben Shapiro was on Joe Rogan's program yesterday, and there was a really interesting discussion about historical racism in the United States, systemic racism, reasons for unequal outcomes in the United States today along racial lines. And it actually is a very relevant conversation about systemic racism. And I have to tell you, Ben Shapiro actually does make some important concessions here, although he always hides them in the right-wing talking points that he's very much attached to. And he probably would have gotten away with a lot more of it had Joe Rogan not pushed back. So let's just jump right in, and I'll comment as we go. I don't know that we need that much introduction.
Is there middle ground? So if we look at 1776 and we look at the Declaration of Independence and we look at America today in 2020, there clearly is some impact in the echoes of slavery, and then after that, Jim Crow. There's clearly some impact in these deeply impoverished communities that don't seem to advance.
Yes. So to make the argument about institutional racism, there's a couple ways you can read this. When people say systemic racism or institutional racism, I usually ask them to be a little more specific in what they mean, because there are a few ways you can read that. One is history has impact. Of course, that's true, right? That's true for everybody. It's true in your family history. Right? If you have a grandfather who went to prison on a particular charge, that leads to poverty for your parents, which led to more poverty for you, right? People have histories. Those histories are embedded in their life experiences, and that's true for societies as well. All of that is for sure true. Then there's the question as to whether the institutions today are racist. And that's not quite the same thing, right? Because history has consequences is not the same thing as saying the rules today are racist. Because the rules today are not racist, actually. The rules today are quite not racist.
So this part of the conversation is very well illustrated by what I call a monopoly analogy, where it's about what the rules are now versus the historical impact. So here's the monopoly analogy, which applies to people like Ben Shapiro saying, listen, we've fixed the rules. We've fixed the problem because the rules now are no longer racist. So with monopoly, everybody starts with the same amount of money and the same amount of property, which is 0 at the beginning of the game. But imagine that 3 players hang around and play Monopoly for an hour, and they start buying up the properties and driving up the rents and putting houses and hotels on the properties, and the utilities are owned, Park Place, Boardwalk, you guys all know Monopoly. And then a 4th player comes in, and everybody's playing by the same rules. That 4th player gets the same amount of money, The fourth player is allowed to buy any property that they want. The fourth player is bound to pay rent if they land on a square that is owned by a different player. So the rules are exactly the same for everybody. They are equitable rules. But the fact that you are starting after a bunch of the properties have been bought up and the rents have been increased is a very much it's an analogy to what we are talking about today in terms of how we fix the law when it comes to race and how we properly dealt with historical issues that are still relevant today. So, for example, we now have hiring non-discrimination laws. You're not allowed to, there's no lower minimum wage for Black or Hispanic workers legally. There's no, you're not allowed to say we only hire white people here, right? That has been fixed, so to speak, but you still have historical redlining and disproportionately people of color living in neighborhoods that were previously areas where folks were pushed to when they were not white, and that relates to the public transit system in a way that makes it more difficult on average to get to work. Even if the employer can no longer discriminate and say, we prefer not to hire Black people or Hispanic people or whatever, you have all of this historical stuff, which is still very relevant. So then the question becomes, well, what, if anything, should we be doing about it? And then Joe Rogan pushes back again.
But historically, it's fairly recent. If you go from the civil rights movement to 2020, we're really not talking about that much time. We're talking
3
about
generations.
50 plus years.
60 years, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
50 plus.
Right,
in the world of, history,
in the vast span of human history, it's not
a very small amount of time.
Right.
So clearly there's some impact of both racism
Absolutely.
and then Jim Crow laws. So that's where I'm saying there's a middle ground.
Yeah, and it is important for people on my side of the aisle, conservatives, to acknowledge and recognize the importance of history in people's living situations now. And it's important for people on the other side of the aisle to, at the same time, not attribute every single thing to history. Because
right. But
people
isn't there
who are born,
always something like that? There's always like extremes on each position, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, but I don't think that it lies as far in the dead center of that as people, I think, want it to.
So this is already an important admission by Ben Shapiro. He says there is a balance. There's a balance between historical impacts and personal responsibility. It's not just about personal responsibility. Now, of course, Ben says it's not 50-50. And that's where the argument is, well, is it 80% historical discrimination and 20% personal agency? Or is it 70% personal and 30% history? We would very much disagree, but it's an important concession that Joe Rogan extracts from Ben Shapiro here. Now let's skip ahead a little bit, and you're going to see that despite making the concession, Ben jumps right back into, this is mostly just Black people have to decide for themselves that they're going to improve their lives and fix the situation. So despite the concession, he still goes back to that.
The way to fight against that is to make good decisions. And so you fight against the system to make sure that the system has rules that apply equally to everyone.
Right, but you clearly see that there's a big difference between people coming over here willingly and doing so in order to better their lives versus someone whose ancestors were dragged over here to be sold as property, and then dealing with the repercussions of that being your family history. And redline laws and all the other things that were put in place to sort of keep them in very specific areas, which to this day remain crime-ridden, gang-ridden, deeply impoverished communities.
Well, that's true, but the question is how much of that is historic redlining and how much of that is an 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody?
But how much of that 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody is based on him growing up in this fucked up environment where that's what he models, where everything around him is crime and gangs, and you imitate your atmosphere, which is what all humans do.
Right, but the answer is there's only one way to break that chain.
What way is that?
That way is to not pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
I think that's a simplistic way of looking at it if you're on the outside of that community and you're not one of those 18-year-old kids that grows up with the incredible influence of all the people around him, and that's all you see, and that's all you know.
Well, but the problem is the only way that's going to be the thing that your kid doesn't know is for you not to do it. At some point, personal agency has to come in.
It does,
because
education and teaching them about personal agency and letting them understand that there's a way out of this and that the path that they see being replicated over and over again by these people that wind up dying young, that wind up going to jail, that there are other options.
So Ben is saying now the only way out is personal agency. Each individual has to just fix the situation for themselves and say, I am going to change stuff. Now, one of the reasons why Ben is successful is that official practical level sounds so obvious, and that's where he gets this reputation if he just tells it like it is. Facts don't care about your feelings. On a very practical level, yes, if an individual takes a different action, then they improve their situation. The problem is that if you fall for that idea, it pushes us to having to say the country no longer has any responsibility. When Ben Shapiro says the only way out is personal agency, it means the country as a whole, all of us, can essentially wash our hands of history and say, just personal agency. They just need to fix it themselves. But here, as Joe Rogan points out, we have to enable people to do that. We have to set people up to do that.
There's a lot of kids that never get that other information. Or if they get it, they get little blips of it. But the vast majority of the information, the vast majority of the influence they get is terrible.
Well, I totally agree with this. And this is why I think the worst thing that you can say to a kid is you're born behind the 8 ball and no matter what you do, you're not going to succeed.
Yes,
right? That's literally the worst thing you can say to a kid. What you should be saying is, look at how your grandfather was born behind the 8 ball and look how hard he had to work in order to get ahead. And look at all the opportunities.
That's true, though. But if your grandfather wasn't ahead, didn't get ahead, if your grandfather was in and out of jail, if your father was in and out of jail, if everyone around you is like that, if there's literally no influence that's positive in your life, the idea of saying to a kid like that, hey, don't pick up a gun and shoot somebody, that's way too simplistic a version of their future, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, the problem is I don't see an alternative solution.
So Joe Rogan rightly points out Ben's idea of pointing to grandpa or dad and saying, there is another path. Look at what grandpa did. Look at what dad did. That only works when grandpa or dad are actually examples of that. And that's the problem. If grandpa or dad were already examples that you want to live up to, we wouldn't have the problem we have on our hands. Sometimes grandpa and dad aren't the right examples. And that is exactly what Joe Rogan is pointing out. And Ben says, well, I just don't see an alternative solution. And of course, there are endless alternative solutions. Now, this is typically where folks like Ben and others will say, reparations won't fix this. And that's often a straw man. I'm not even thinking of reparations. And it is actually true that whether you can make a moral case for handing cash to people is not at issue, because just handing cash to people won't actually fix the issues Joe Rogan is talking about here. We need to go further than, are the rules racist on paper today? And Ben is right that on paper, the rules are mostly not racist today. But that's a way to wash our hands of the problem, to say we fixed the rules and they're now fine. And that's it. Well, that runs into the monopoly paradox that I outlined earlier. So now we actually need to do the tough work of figuring out what's the right way to go forward now that we've fixed the rules on paper. Fixing the rules on paper is step one, right? It's not the solution. And there's the historical piece that Joe Rogan points out. Now, just one more brief element here. The topic of Colin Kaepernick kneeling came up in sort of a weird way. Let's just take a look at it, and I have a few thoughts about it.
Like when people say it's hard to make money in this country, there are a lot of people making money a lot of different ways in this country. And I mean, for God's sake, Colin Kaepernick is making millions of dollars kneeling for the national anthem. It feels like, and calling America racist while cashing the check. This is a great damned country.
Well, we're getting into the weeds. I just wanted to talk about girls ripping dudes off.
I know you did, but we can go back there, man. That's okay.
But the Colin Kaepernick thing, all right. Don't you think that
so this is all we
at
got
least
from the
some...
video. And I want to correct something. The other man said that black people are holding so much to history. The same history you all are denying and running away from learning. The same history they don't want to teach. I mean, you already do need to know the history. First, teach it so that you all will understand it. So that because they always feel like black people always fall back to the history of what happened to them. Yes, because that is their foundation. You don't let go of your foundation. Your foundation is your starting point. So How do you want somebody to forget about his or her starting point? And you people don't tell people how to feel. Yeah, you can't tell people how to feel about a certain thing that happened to them or how to hold on to it. And for reparations, whether it's going to fix it or not, pay them their reparations first. Let them know what they want to do with it. Then they can, like, you know, forge ahead on their own. I am sure most of them don't even want to stay with you all anymore there. I mean, so want to get their reparations and find a way out to, like, you know, so many things and figure some certain things out. So that reparation is really very important. And yeah, I think this is all I got to contribute on this. Probably like I have forgotten so many things I don't know about that. This is what I really do have to say. I absolutely will read all your comments. Let me know what you all think in the comment section. And see you all in my next video. Bye for now.